Hi, Mike. Hi, Laura.
Hello, how's it going?
All right. How are you?
Doing all right. Just grabbing a bite of lunch while we wait to get started.
Yep. Right. It's 2 minutes past, and since this is summer in Europe, well, summer in the Northern Hemisphere in general, but
No, only in Europe.
yeah. I mean, Europe is more famous than North America for people taking lots of summer vacation. All that said, I don't know how many people will turn up, but we have all the owners of items on the agenda, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to the July 23rd SIG Multicluster call. And first on the agenda is Ryan.
Hello. So I think last time I spent some time present the doc. Let me share the doc again. Let me see if I can share my screen. How to share my screen?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Oh. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so last time we talked about, I presented this flow, and also Corentin presented more like the registration part. There were some discussions about, there are two, as far as I know, there are two unsolved issues. One is, before I get into details, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this proposal. I'm not sure if everyone is already was in that meeting before. If not, I can go over that like really quickly. Does that help? Or I can just pick up where we left.
I think a summary would be useful.
Cool. So this is a proposal to, so the main, let me kind of get back to really at the beginning of this whole cluster inventory API story is Argo CD and some third-party applications would like to utilize the multi-cluster management capabilities, but they don't want to reinvent the wheel. So like Argo CD and the multi-queue, they all need to scheduling or work with multiple clusters, but they do not want to reinvent what a lot of other multi-cluster specific or specialized multi-cluster projects like OCM, Fleet, ClusterNet, Kamada, things like that. So they asked us if we could kind of have a unified API so that they can integrate with any of the multi-cluster projects instead of integrating with write different adapters for each proprietary APIs. So that's what this cluster inventory story is, like the whole idea is. And after a while, we finally get to this API, which is called a cluster profile. But the cluster profile API currently doesn't actually have a credential field or any information in the credential part. Credential means how do you access that cluster with basic authentication and authorizations. So to fulfill our task to integrate, allow Argo CD or some other third-party applications to integrate with the cluster managers, this is kind of the doc to give a very high-level idea, and so that we can have the community, like want to get some feedbacks from the community to see if that idea is if mostly we have a consensus on that flow. And for that, there are actually two parts. The first part is the third-party application, again, Argo CD or Q or something else, that they first need to let the multi-cluster management system know what type of credential they use, including how they can authenticate themselves and what type of RBAC roles they need. So this part is what Corentin, if anyone is interested. I don't know if I click this, if everyone can see this presentation or not. Can you see this presentation too? Okay. Yeah, so Corentin gave a high-level description of how he called this a feature registration. The terminology is TBD, but they are basically the same thing. We are register a feature or application. So there is a flow there that would give a this is just a rough idea. But this doc is more about trying to get the API finalized, or at least get the consensus. We had this discussion in the KubeCon EU. I think Stefan led that discussion. We had a lot of discussion at that time. It's been about 3-4 months. We're trying to close that loop. So At that time, I think we were not very clear on the entire flow. But currently, I think at least from some of the maintainers of that cluster inventory project's standpoint of view, this is what we are envisioning. So there is a registration flow, which is totally different from the cluster profile API. Cluster profile API is just a API for the third party to integrate. This is not part of it. This is what, again, let me stress, this is what we are trying to get, but that's still very, very early. With this doc, we're just trying to get to the point of get this API finalized or consensus. And with this flow, yeah, again, this flow actually is not really related to this API. It just explained why some of the information is not in this API and some of the information is in this API. What is in this API is actually something like this. This part I think is relatively less controversial. Is we are going to have some kind of credential in that API, and in that API, as we know that normally we don't want to put all the credentials into the same same cluster. So credentials, by credential, I mean the authentication part. Some of the authentication part doesn't have to be preserved as a secret and parked on the hub cluster. But in any case, we are going to use object reference to store the credentials. Oh, Nick, you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to finish, I have a question I want to kind of ask at the end.
Oh,
or I
okay.
can ask it now. It's up to you.
Okay, okay. Let me finish. It's pretty. I think I need just like another minute. Yep. So the problem is there are this part I think is relatively less controversial and have some consensus, because this is very, very generic, right? You can reference to any object and which contains some of the either have some RBACs, either have some credential authentication ways to authenticate yourself to that a member cluster workload cluster. There's some different opinions or options when how do we organize that? So one way is we want to organize one cluster profile per cluster per application. So that the main reason is the RBACs, the credentials are a lot easier to, or the RBACs is a lot easier to handle, because each application would have everything in their own namespace. The downside is it kind of defies the purpose of a cluster profile, because the cluster profile is supposed to be the single point of integration point between a cluster and any applications, or it's kind of a representation of a cluster in this system. Now you can have multiple kind of incarnation of that cluster in the control plane. That makes the whole concept a little bit convoluted. Another option is to have still keeping this one cluster profile per cluster, but in that case we need to store or kind of cram all of the credentials related informations into this API. And currently what we propose is we will actually have the real credentials, like the secret, into a different namespace. For example, the cluster profile is actually in the fleet system, right? But the queue secret is actually in queue system, and Argo CD secret is in Argo system. So that when the time we need to assign RBACs for the queue systems, they will have queue admins. Their RBAC would be in. They have read access to fleet system and read access to cube system, so that they can be. There are some questions last time about this cross namespace reference. Mike last time presented something that might be interesting. But that is still like V1 Alpha 1, and I'm not 100% sure how these two work together. Maybe Mike can expand a little bit.
Yeah, I think maybe this is, before we go, like this is kind of around the space of my question, so I think I'm just going to ask it now. So I read through all this. I read through some other stuff Corentin showed me, and I'm really struggling to see what problem this solves in the context of all of the way I see customers implementing multi-cluster platforms today. It's not a problem that we have specifically on GKE, and it's actually probably not even a problem on AKS because you have workload identity. But if like the cluster profile is on a central cluster, and you're looking at that secret that you're mounting into that cluster profile, for example, like that secret is just about authentication, really, right? Like the authorization comes from the other cluster, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that we should build a system that the central cluster is creating RBAC on those downstream clusters. I don't see what problem that solves. That's not a problem that customers, I don't think they want to, like they solve that problem today in CD pipelines, whether it's infrastructure or it's code, like that problem's already solved. Like, why are we trying to solve that problem here? I'm not sure I really get it, to be honest.
Okay. Also, I'm not sure what is the problem they already solved. So, for example,
so let me give you an example. So, usually this comes around bootstrapping, right? Like if you want to set up Flux or Argo CD or something, it's before you have a GitOps tool, right? So there's that problem of, okay, the GitOps tool that I have needs some stuff installed in it, right? That's generally solved in the infrastructure as code, not the configuration, but the infrastructure as code pipeline. So if I was using Terraform or whatever tool, Pulumi, when I deploy that cluster, I'm going to bake into that cluster the necessary permissions that I need to manage it from the cluster profile, right? Like I'm not going to expect a cluster profile to then come up and make those changes. And if I need to change that over time, I'm changing it in the pipeline that's driving my infrastructure as code, not because it's a bootstrapping. It's part of the cluster build process. I see it.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you mean. So I think we need to go back to that flow. First thing, let me stress again: the cluster profile API is not a cluster API, so it's not actionable. It's not it's a quote what we discussed about. It's more like a status. It's a read-only thing. Most of them are read-only. It's reflective of what it has, not actionable one.
Right.
So all these cluster role binding, all these things are going to go through this API, the Kubernetes API. The user are going to say, of course, if you say user, if the users you think are already using Terraform and everything is to set up that cluster, then that's a different story. What we seeing that, at least from the one thing you can see this is multi-queues setup. I don't know if you can see that. What we are trying to do is basically replace this whole thing. See, these are what the user needs to put to add one managed cluster into multi-queue. What we are trying to do, this whole flow is trying to automate this whole thing so that user don't have to actually don't have to do anything. It'll be a lot faster for them to we're replacing this flow basically. So whether this is the solve the problem, it's I mean, there's nothing unsolvable, right? It's all boils down to could be applied.
Code. Yeah.
But could be code apply. But
I guess
to simplify.
I just don't see that this is like the problem that needs solving. I guess I don't know. I think a customer would really use it. Like, at least the customers that I work for that are heavily regulated and whatnot, they're not going to just. You're basically adding another super user.
I don't think that's the implication of what Ryan is talking about right now. I do think that this like workflow thing shows that set up RBAC for clusters line, right? And that's what you're that's what you're talking about, Nick, right?
Yeah.
And I do feel that this graph implies that registration of the application was a trigger that caused that to happen. And I think you're saying that like some other thing or some other infrastructure as code or during bootstrapping, which could have been some totally other time that is like not in here. It could have been that. I think that's true, and maybe we should edit this graph to make it clear that the registration of the application is not always the trigger for the RBAC to occur. But I think what Ryan is talking about right now is just that if someday the RBAC was good on one side and the credential could get sent by something, what does the cluster profile API like have in it, like assuming all of that went well? And I do think there is some specifics to debate about like what are our guarantees about like how and when that could get filled, and like when are we saying something else out of band of cluster profile as a, you know, controller or something is the thing that's triggering that versus anything else. But yeah, I do see your point, but I also think it's not what Ryan is specifically talking about right now.
Sorry. Yeah, I thought we were talking about bootstrapping the authorization on the destination clusters during this process. If we're just talking about on like authenticating, right? Just I have this secret. I am who I say I am.
Yeah, I think we're even talking about, I think we're even at so simple of a point of like somebody we trusted said this cluster has this credential and I'm going to write it in my diary. What does my diary say? That's it.
Okay.
Exactly. We are very, yeah, unfortunately we are at the very, very beginning of this this journey. we are just at the point of, as I said, as Laura really summarized it well, that we don't have any of these actually. We don't have any of these. These are, again, what coroutines flow is more about. We don't have it. We're assuming that this already happens. This API is more about, we assuming this already happens. How can we present the information for the third party to use it? Because unfortunately, our API doesn't have the information for any of them to use. If they have another way to say, set up this thing, whatever thing they did this whole thing right, and then we still need to somehow reflect that in our API. And this part is that's the reason, and the reason I try to separate this whole flow from this API is that, as I understand this, as we all agree, this is a very complicated flow, a lot of implications, a lot of different angles to attack that. That's why I'm trying to separate this discussion from this API. We just want to decide what the API looks like, and then we can decide whether it was the setup part was done by something else. We are going to create something for the user, or it's already done. But yeah, again, this.
Okay, sorry, I think I misunderstood. I was probably crossing up what you're presenting now with what Corentin had presented where he went to France yesterday.
Exactly. That's the big. Like, I'm really trying to separate these two. Otherwise, this API would never. I mean, not never, but it will take another. We'll see in EU 2025 still discussing this API. So we're trying to wrap up this up so that at least we can write some demos, right? So assuming that the complicated authentication authorization part is done by something else, then this is just a reflecting. We can grab this API, then we can integrate. So we can have some.
This is basically about, do I reuse a token, or do I need a token per application that's taking advantage of cluster profile, and then where do those live? Got it.
Yeah, exactly. And like, for example, Argo CD doesn't have some Argo CD maintainers wrote somewhere that they currently don't have like cluster profile equivalent APIs. They just use the secret, like
secrets.
Just a secret, which, so it's not a non-schematized, some kind of just convention of you have some fields there. So they clearly, we have some format there. Clearly is I feel like this has some contents here. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for you. So it sounds like you're focusing on the credentials part, right? So in the case of you have workload identity, what would those secret contain? It's like pretty much they would just take the principal, put it in there, and put the endpoint, right?
Yeah.
That would be the extent of it, of what that secret contains, right?
Corentin, it's exactly like how you would use our workload identity with Argo CD today. If you look at that secret, it just has that well-known URI, and then the name, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's something we could build. If the cluster profile just had the endpoint, then we don't even need to know what the apps are, right? If we had a property of the cluster profile that was the endpoint of the cluster, then any, like, if Argo built in or in one of their plugin knew how to look at cluster profiles, they wouldn't need that, would they?
What do you mean they don't need the, for workload identity, do they not need that principal ID? They need a,
if you have workload identity, their principal will be static. It'll be whatever the mapping of their Kubernetes service account to whatever workload identity federation they use, right? So it'll be static for every single cluster. You won't get a different workload identity per cluster.
Where is that information? How can user like Argo CD, how do they know this ID?
Oh, they would have to configure it. And ultimately, I mean, the only thing that really cares about it is the RBAC that they write in those clusters. And that's why I was targeting this problem and had a bunch of discussion with Nick and Bobby and Xingyao internally. And yeah, I was like, I don't want to reinvent a new CI/CD system, so I'm kind of like backing off a little bit, some introverted thinking at this point on why are we doing this. But yeah, the case I would like to see potentially is workload identity. Is like, what does it look like for kubeconfig? Like, it sounds here you're getting a kubeconfig every time, right?
No. This is definitely doesn't, because we know that in most production ready cases, nobody want to put their credentials or like the secrets into real token into every cluster token into the one single hub cluster. That is probably their security guys are going to scream at them. So we're assuming in the more production ready systems, the real token will not be in the secret. But this is for more for open source. If you look at Argo CD Q, they put their secret there. So to integrate with those systems, at least make it work, we allow them to enable them to put a real secret onto the hub cluster. But yeah, we agree. I think everybody knows that for the real production, at least with any cloud provider based authentication system, the secret is not stored anywhere. Like the real token is not stored anywhere in the cluster. This should work with, because this is as I said, this is just object reference. So it could be super. It can be anything. It doesn't have to be a secret. This is just really to work with. Currently, we work with Argo CD and the Q. They are actually putting the token kube. For the Q, it is a kubeconfig actually. Argo CD is basically the secret, a different form of kubeconfig.
Right. So what this API that you're talking about is doing is generating a kubeconfig, or there is a kubeconfig somewhere and writing it into a secret, right?
If we want to integrate with Argo CD and the Q, yes. So the controller, the multi-cluster controller, this guy would put that secret onto the hub cluster, into this proposal. This guy is actually I call it multi-cluster manager, is the one that is emitting this object, this status object, the cluster profile object, and by emitting it, it needs to get the secret. Assuming that the credential, everything is done outside of this loop, it just needs to put that information into that API so that some third-party application can consume. Does that make sense? Does it? So again, this is a very simple, supposedly very simple problem. We're just and probably didn't really solve a lot of the problems, but we need this first to get the ball rolling. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Laura.
This isn't a question, but more just some impressions. I definitely agree with, like, this is what the integrators need to like be able to build off their integration. So yeah, I totally agree that this is kind of like what we need to get on. I'm very interested in the cross namespace reference stuff that was alluded to a little bit, because yeah, I think this problem is very similar to Gateway API's personas problem. So yeah, I would love to converge on that somehow. And yeah, maybe also, I'm not sure if everybody has familiarity with that. And honestly, it's been kind of a while for me too, but the idea that, how to say, like that, there is some centralized source of truth that might be from like a trusted user, but then there are these application type users who need access only to part of it, and they may need like a list of things in a central namespace, but they shouldn't really get access to everything, or the reference should be over in their namespace that they have access to, and they don't just get like carte blanche access to the source namespace. Yeah, that seems like super relevant here to the idea of like there's different types of applications and features. They do need to have like the whole window view of like all the clusters, but just for them, you know, but then we don't want to make it really painful that cluster profile like data is like super fragmented across different namespaces. I agree that that feels really ooky. So anyways, those are my comments and feelings.
Now I think you actually reminded me. Maybe I now get why Mike sent a link about that. I forget its name. He mentioned that work gateway API too.
That gateway API has the cross namespace references. Yeah.
At that time I didn't fully get it. And I also read the spec a little bit. Now I kind of maybe I get maybe. Let me see if I understand how this might work. Is here the cluster profile? Initially, I thought we will give for example here this same case, right? Argo CDs admin would have access to, as I said, have access to everything into. Is this one? No, sorry, this one. So would have because cluster profile is in fleet system, right? If I give Argo CD admin admins read RBAC for everything in fleet system, then they can actually see queue secret, although they don't have RBAC to look into the queue system. Right. Probably that's the reason it's not good. Then with this field, I think there's a field attribute in that new proposal. They can filter out field. Does that mean that we can filter out, like you can only see your side, you can see this side? Like for Argo, you can see this, but you cannot see someone else. Not even see this part. Initially, I thought it was okay to see it because we will not give them access to this namespace. But I guess maybe I'm not a security guy. Maybe this is also too much for them to see everybody else stuff.
Yeah, I do think there's some security conscious and like data leak customers who would still not like this, though I understand that it's better than just, like spitting the secret right there or whatever. But yeah, I do think like the next tier is basically what the gateway API had to come up with for their problem.
Okay, I see. Okay, I think now I get the relation between these two now. That'd be cool. I think again, I'll leave it to a security expert. We can discuss more in the next step. But now I think at least I get some ideas. Okay, with this, let me move on to the next big topic. We have multiple discussions about this, and I think Mike has another one after this, is spec versus status. So last time when I presented this, I was mentioning the preference was to have both the spec and the status. Because let me recap, this is sort of like a status object, but we still feel like it's better for the truth, like the credential, real truth, whether it's a secret or identity, in the status as the truth. But since initially we don't have that flow, the coroutines flow, I was thinking that we can put that into the spec. Means this is what user wants. This is kind of like a poor man's version of that whole flow. Without that whole flow, I would put that. But with internal discussions, I mean, talking to different stakeholders in this project, and last time Jack also mentioned that with both spec and the state, it could be pretty confusing, especially given that we assume there's another loop, whatever that loop is, can solve this, set up this credential, RBAC, everything problem. So that's now, I think our preference is we're just going to leave this in the status, keep it very clean, only as a status object, no more dual purpose object. It's still keep it as a status object. And without that loop, then if nothing is set up there, then we would just assume it's admin. Just like I think most of actually currently Argo CD and Q probably is using admin anyway. So the default is we're going to have admin access to all the clusters, which is definitely not recommended for anyone. But at least you get the string ball rolling. You can have a demo, quick start things that people can use. Yeah, so we have changed this preference a little bit. Any question? I see Laura has a thumbs up. I hope that works.
Yeah, I like status.
Cool. And then finally, I think the secret format, we had some different options now we think is since the third party, we have so many different third parties, we would just instead of have adapter different types for each parties, we will create our own format, most likely similar to kubeconfig. And then if third party has any need to convert to their existing ones, we can help. Either we create a library or something that's kind of small technical issues. The gap is what exactly Nick was referring to. This is the part that we don't have, and we don't plan to address that, at least in this API or cap change. We just want to get the API finalized. And then we can talk about this gap, how we can, how to make that work. Any questions or any comments, suggestions, or especially like for Stefan, what's the next step? Are we going to, if this works, are we going to move to a cap, or do we need to get to the cap, or because we already have the CRDs there, we just don't have the field. For this, what is the recommended way to move forward? Of course, I still welcome any comments, suggestions, things like that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if we need a separate cap or if we can just
definitely not separate cap.
No,
just
just
add
update
back
the
to that
current one.
Yeah.
Laura has her hand up again.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not fully with you on the secret format part. I know it's like kind of TBD, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah. So for example, the Q and Argo both have their own secret format. For example, I don't know if you
like literally the way the secret is, and then they can parse it properly. Okay.
Yeah. So there are two ways to do that for us, right? One is initially in the here. Initially in this credential part, actually, I had a field called a type. For example, we can say this this is a secret, and this is a kubeconfig secret. Actually, the object reference doesn't have to be a secret. So it will be like kubeconfig secret, and that would fit directly into Q. Q would get this and doesn't have to pass it at all. They can use it directly. And then Argo has a different way to organize its secrets, right? So I was saying we could have Argo secret, whatever you call it, right? But think of that, at least the current preference, and after talking to some other project like the OCM, Kamada, the ClusterNet guys, we think that it's probably better to keep our own format. Give this. So Laura, is your question about what our format looks like, or your question is about whether we keep our
no.
overall?
Well, I think I understand that we probably don't know what our format looks like, and it sounds like the question is, are we going to have a conventional format that we're going to be like, yo, this is how it needs to be, and your thing needs to work with that, or we provide this parsing library that does something or whatever.
Parsing library.
Okay.
So let me clarify that. So when we have our own format, and we don't expect the third party to change their main logic to parse our secret, but we will provide a library. All right, most likely we will submit a PR into their repo and switch to basic adapter. Basically, the adapter, it will be in the third party applications repo instead of in our repo. So in that repo, we would have to basically grab our secret format and look at their secret format and convert that. Then the rest of their flow will be the same, because I don't expect everyone to change the main flow. So we will do that so that they will be the rest of flow won't change. So our PR will be like more technically, our PR will be very small, and the integration PR will be pretty tiny, instead of touching everywhere in their code base.
Yeah, this is a deep philosophical question about where our standards writing ends and where their standards pickup begins. So yeah, I totally get that. Because at some point, like if we have a custom format, well, I think as you know, this is something more to talk about. I do think in our case for this one, having these concrete and use cases like Argo and Q helps us like define like kind of the limits of what that convention might be of what we know right now. And I think we can kind of operate in that world until and unless we hear otherwise.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, that would be the next step after we get the API there. Then we will have Corentin and I actually have a talk about integrating with Argo CD and Q. Hopefully by I mean, we are proposing a talk, not that we're going to talk yet. Hopefully by that time we could have some demos that with this API finalized, we could have some demos to showcase that capability. By that time, we would run into this. Definitely, we will run into this problem, and then we will bring this to the community again to discuss. Okay, with that, again, going back to the next step. So, Stefan, do you have any more thoughts on that?
Not off the top of my head, but I guess the next step would be to submit a PR.
To the CAP, right?
To the CAP, yeah.
To amend the CAP to
yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's discuss on the PR then. Okay, that's it. I think I got my Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. So next up is Mike.
All right. I'll share my screen if I can in a minute.
Yeah.
I can't stop looking at your owl clock.
I was just gonna say that. Oh my God. I was like, should I say something or not? But yeah, it's super cool.
It's my video conference keep alive.
I love it.
See, if I stop moving,
we know that you're still that in this dimension.
Yeah, I'm just thinking and not.
Oh my God, I love that.
Frozen.
I find my head just moving from side to side. I'm like, wait, what are you doing? Stop being hypnotized by the owl.
Oh, I think we lost Mike altogether somehow.
Oh, I think he needs to he needs to restart his.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Zoom would ask for like permissions to present or something like that. Get your Mike is back.
Sorry, I had to give Zoom permissions to actually be able to share my screen. All right, here we go. So this was just a minor bump of I would appreciate reviews on this. It's just adding an alternatives considered section to the cluster profile CAP, basically documenting the decision to do namespace scoped cluster profile CRDs instead of cluster scoped. We went back and forth on this for 2 months at least, so it felt worth kind of encoding it in the CAP as just like historical context.
Yeah, thanks for that.
So yep, would appreciate reviews so we can get that landed, but there's nothing substantial to this other than just documenting past conversations. And then with that kind of moving on, next topic is I would love to kind of identify clear next steps for service import. So I don't think you were there, Laura, but we had a conversation in this SIG MC meeting like 4 weeks ago where we went pretty deep into like what is the proper structure for the service import CRD. Right now, it has these fields nested under spec, which is somewhat problematic because it feels like a thing. Well, not just feels like, it's a thing that users can modify when
Right.
in actuality they probably shouldn't. There in the Google MCS documentation, it is documented that Google moved those fields under status.
Yeah.
The discussion that we had a couple weeks ago was that it is believed that is actually a documentation bug rather than an actual
Yeah.
change that was made. So I would love to kind of like get clarity on that. And then there's a couple other basically like things that came out of that discussion is trying to align on, should we move these fields from spec over to status, or should we just abolish spec status entirely? So yeah, I would love to kind of like, one, get clarity from Google folks on what y'all currently have implemented. And
Okay, yeah,
then
let me dig
okay.
on that. Yeah.
Awesome. That would be excellent. And then I think Jeremy OT mentioned something about wanting a small clarification to the MCS API cap about like who is writing service import CRDs.
Yeah. Yeah, just a comment, and sorry if this was like mentioned in the big hash out smackdown that I missed, but um,
all good.
but yeah, I think service import in particular has always been a little bit weird, especially I feel like early reference implementations, like the spec energy was like more relevant, and then like as we have more cases where like this other controller is doing like the IP address management, and it's not really realistic that like that's changeable to any degree by an end user. Yeah, so I do feel like there's some historical legacy weirdness there, and I also so I understand like the underlying problem. And yeah, I agree with this point that like clarifying that, especially in light of all the implementations that we have now, like super valid update.
Cool. And then yeah, basically like flowing out from that is kind of the question of like, should
Yeah.
these fields move to status and we keep spec as like a, like, is there any use case that we want to support in the future of a user manually creating a service import to request
Right.
importing a
Request.
service?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that was the original intention, though I can see how that is a side effect. Like, I feel like the reason this was there was more not even user request, but just like a technical convenience of like, can I get this IP, or like I know this IP is like okay to have. So yeah, I don't think we have a lot of strong like hard requirements around this, but I can see why as a side effect of its existence it could be used in that way, and that is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's something that like I've basically considered it could be useful if we ever want to do like a cross cluster set kind of import of like where basically sameness isn't assumed, so your controller can't automatically create the import, so you have to have a user create it manually, and then the controller sets things in terms of on the status of like what you actually got and like if it's a valid import. I think that Tim Hawken and Nick, who's on the call, were of the opinion that we probably should explicitly rule out that case. For what it's worth, like it's something that nobody has implemented yet, and maybe it's a terrible idea. I want to make sure that we have alignment on implementations of like, if we're going to rule that out, that everybody's okay with that.
Okay.
Wasn't there actually a project somewhere that documented manually creating a service import in order to get the service locally?
So we
I thought we'd
did
come across that.
So yeah, so we did something similar to that in console. It's not actually using service import, but it is like manually creating the reference to import things across where there is potentially not like that sameness assumption. And then Karmata is the other one where I don't
Yeah.
think that they support that use case, but their documentation describes a user manually creating the service import. So I definitely want, if someone has contacts there, I would love to kind of like get their eyes on this proposal too.
It's hazy, but I think there's an Istio overlap too with like the Istio implementation that was like service import only.
I can dig deeper on the Istio one if there's something.
Yeah, I think there's
you
something there.
remember.
It's so hazy right now. So let me like also.
Well, so if I
but yeah.
remember correctly, you can configure Istio to piggyback on top of an MCS provider, and so then it will consume service imports without generating service exports. But then
Yeah.
I think it's just consuming it. But then that there are probably
I thought it was
implementations where you
making it.
can. All right.
I don't
Okay.
know. Let me. Yeah, I gotta dig it.
Yeah.
Sorry. But something is there. But whether
Yeah,
it directly is analogous to this, I guess TBD. But yeah.
But
Yeah,
in any case, it
there
feels like
isn't-
we're working around namespace sameness, which has always been a fairly core
Right.
assumption of the MCS API. So
Yeah, and I think this is also butting up against to bring up Gateway API again, like I feel in the world of like Gateway API, like this delineation between like the thing that like the I forget the names of the personas, but the like route creator or whatever, like what they can make. I think there was some talk at some point of like, is that what like could somebody make a service import to signal that like they want their stuff in, and like that's within the their power to do. But I do think I do think it's pretty stable at this point that like MCS is not as persona, like those two persona driven.
yeah, Brian, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just curious on the consumer side, right? So the service import, how do we envision the service import being consumed? Is I normally when I consume an API, I consume its status, right? If I don't consume its spec, so this case, use who is the MCS? For example, if it is somehow gateway API, we had a gateway API and MCS integration discussion at one point, right? Assuming somehow MCS becomes the backend of gateway API, so the gateway API controller are going to watch the spec of the service import in this case, right? When the spec changes.
Yeah, that's right.
And
yeah, same as the DNS server for the DNS server that handles cluster set.local.
So they need to watch the spec, but it doesn't do anything to the status. It just watch the spec.
So yeah, I think currently that is the case, which is weird. And what it should be doing is it should either be watching a status or watching a flat object that's more like endpoints that doesn't have that spec size delineation, where it's just watching that resource for changes.
What's in the status of MCS
now? There's only one thing in it currently. I forget off the top of my head.
I'm trying to find that out. Yeah,
it's clusters.
Okay.
Cluster name.
Cluster name.
Yeah, so that's like what, just the list of clusters that the service has been imported from, or has endpoints from. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
What do we envision user use that information for? And why is this in the status and the IP is in the spec?
Well, that's basically the whole question.
Yeah, that's the basis of the whole question, and I think is like a legacy leftover from early iterations of this, where there was more hand holding about the IP address management for like the supercluster cluster set IP. So yeah, I do think it's something that we can back out of. I think as Mike opened this all with, there is a, feature possible by the way that it is organized now. But yeah, I do think putting our brain power a little bit to decide if we care about that or not will simplify this, because I do think the direct, like the intuition we all have is that it should be in status.
Yeah, so again, how do we move forward with this? Any suggestions, Stefan,
I
Laura?
think
So
I think we're okay with that. The foreclose the cross cluster set non-sameness manual usage of service import.
yeah, I think that's fine too.
Yeah,
If we
I
ju-
want to go that direction.
Is that something, do you know, Ryan, that's going to be okay from our end? I don't think we have any plan in Azure
Yeah.
Fleet to do something like that.
No. So just let me see if I understand. So the plan is to just explicitly says they cannot set it's not supposed to be set by, like, manually to set the spec, right? To add that to the cap to clarify. Is that what the suggestion
Yes.
is?
Yeah.
And then just keep-
Except as a consequence of synchronizing service exports, really, because like as was mentioned there, yeah, not a human manual human controller. So the spec is written from the perspective that you could, in theory, have a manual
Yeah.
human controller, and that would be a valid reason for writing service imports. But apart from that, nobody should be writing service imports.
Okay, and then keep this spec status separate and just move forward, get to the GA, or at least move to the V1 alpha, V1 beta, things like that. Is that the plan?
This is not a blocker for that, I don't think.
Oh yeah, and no, yeah, definitely not.
This is just something else.
Yeah, but what about is there any consensus in this community
Yeah.
to whether keep it or kind of correct the historical legacy thing, or just leave it there?
So I think we need to change what exists currently, because that's having things like IP in spec, which makes them user editable, whether we say you should or shouldn't. And that's kind of a problem. It's an open question of whether things should move over to status, like is in the PR currently that I have open, or if we should collapse spec status and just like remove that top level stanza entirely and just have everything just on the root.
Yeah, were there concerns? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
No, I was just say I would vote for that, getting rid of the spec status.
Yeah, because if I remember correctly, there were concerns last time around about, the fact that you can't, you're not supposed to create an object with its status immediately. So there's a ping pong if we don't collapse everything.
Yeah, ironically, if we collapse everything, we leave because spec is saying something specific about when and who does it. Status is saying something specific about when and who does it, but putting in the root isn't saying anything specific. So we still can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
Best of all worlds.
All right. Let's
start that way.
Yeah. All right. So I can update the PR to make that change, and yeah, if you can kind of double check on the Google implementation,
I will.
And if there's confirm if there's consensus internally at Google for dropping spec status entirely. And then after we have those confirmations and updates, if someone has a contact at Karmata, that would be really helpful to get their eyes on it, because they're the other kind of prominent implementation of MCS that has not typically been on this call.
Marina, is any Marina? I think there's a Marina implementation.
The Submariner, yeah, but Steven's here.
Steven, so
Yeah,
Steven,
and Tom.
so you're okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
Kamada, yeah, I have contact. But they are, at different time zone, language, all these things. Mike,
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get you connected. But yeah, I'll actually reach out to them directly then.
Cool. Well, yeah, I can work with you on drafting something to share with them. That sounds good,
Cool.
Ryan.
Cool. Great.
All right.
Yeah.
This is great. Thanks everyone. I'm excited that we feel like we have a bit of a path forward now.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. Yeah, so we've managed to work our way through the agenda just in time.
Woohoo!
Yay.
So thanks
Woo!
everyone. See you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
See ya.
All right. Take care. Bye, y'all.
Bye.